camp gym in northern Minnesota. And this certainly included the normal retreat things, and it had like broom ball, the awkward drama involving the tensions of high school love. I mean, there was a lot of sweating, and particularly the boys, including myself, refusing to shower. There was the chapel talks that caused you to feel just a little bit convicted, and the downtimes in which leaders had a lot of awkward small talk and a lot of napping. However, this retreat contains an element which then and now I find uniqueness. See, on this retreat there's actual opportunities to share what's burdening us in our everyday life, and for some reason people want to listen. Entering into this weekend, I found myself just starting to actually wonder what this experience called faith was. And all the while I was holding baggage and burdens which I'd kept secret for my whole life, fearing that no one would ever care. And if they did care, it was to really harm me and point out all the ways that my sin made me incapable of being loved by God. Because to have faith at this moment in my life was to be constantly feeling God's presence, to memorize both verses of the Bible and Hillsong classics, and
you right.
about all things avoiding the brokenness of humanity. Yet, in the midst of my fear of imperfection, I was gifted with a glimpse of the empathetic and compassionate, loving embrace of God. On the Saturday night of this retreat, there was a strange, beautiful pause in the busyness of our life, where all who were on the retreat gathered in the small, dark basement of our retreat center. We packed all the mattresses and pillows together, and then there was a chair in front of everyone. And it was on this chair that people could choose to vulnerably share what was burdening their lives. And they had a confidence that their identity in Christ was still affirmed, and those alongside them truly cared for them. Being that I never shared what was burdening my heart before, it took long into the night in order to gather my courage enough to be vulnerable with my peers. And I remember the trembling in my legs still as I made my way through the mattress maze and sat down in front of them. As I shared my truths, I looked down on the floor and tears started dripping down my face and onto my maroon sweatshirt from high school. But yet, as I shared this brokenness, I remember those in the room shifting, scuffling, and rushing across the carpet. And suddenly many started to put and set their warm hands on me and showered me in love and grace. As I looked up with tears still flowing, I suddenly saw that I was in a new family. And as someone who's had a brother, but having that brother be so old that I really grew up an only child, this new sensation of family had unspeakable power for me. It was in this vulnerable space which I was embraced by God's love through those around me, who didn't seek to change me or avoid my shit. Rather, they wanted to love me as a child of God, as a person who is created in this divine image. As I look back on my own life, I would argue that this is the place where I first began to realize that God loved me. As many of you know, last semester and over the course of this year, I've had the chance to read a couple books by Addie, in which she shares her story in a profound vulnerability. And she shows that the reality of our life is one that will never be linear, perfect, or without a whole lot of shit in the middle of it. While I initially was thinking of these books in regards to how the evangelical culture might create some tangible checkpoints, which I would argue are actually really harmful and unrealistic, what actually captivated me about this story was how many came into Addie's life and empathetically embraced her as she was in her deepest void. And it was in these relationships which Addie shares that she came to feel a grace of God that didn't avoid her brokenness, but instead chose to enter into it with compassion and empathy. As I was reflecting back on Addie's work through her two books, as well as my own life, I began to really understand that it is in the relationships which share in our shit with an empathetic embrace that we just might encounter the profoundly transformational and everlasting love of God. I argue this because as humans, we are divinely designed to be in connection with others. And I would argue that this divine embrace of empathy allows us to feel like we are known, that we belong, and that we can become vulnerable with one another. We as humans are divinely designed to be in relationship with one another. In fact, Brene Brown points out that connection is why we are here. We are hardwired to connect with others, and it is what gives our life meaning and purpose. And without it, there's suffering. This means that connection is a fundamental piece of our well-being and wholeness. Pamela Cooper White also joins with Brown in helping us understand the vitality of connection with others, ascribing that without relationships which help us feel known and valued, we can't survive. Without relationships which make us feel known and belonging, we enter into a void which actually fundamentally affects our ability to be human. In this void, I would argue that someone having empathy for us has profound value. And empathy is often described as the ability to share with one's feelings, but myself as well as Andy Root would take it deeper and say that empathy requires the courageous act of throwing aside our own wants and desires, instead indwelling in one another so deeply that we might share in their place. Empathy requires the hardest sacrifice that we can do within our world of putting others way before ourselves while offering compassionate companionship as they share their sacred journeys with us. This feeling of empathy is much deeper than just a pat on the back when someone's sad, and instead it's a full-on embrace of one another in our attempt to put ourselves fully in their position. In this sacrifice of putting others before ourselves, empathy begets the creation of an emotional resonance. And it's this sense of resonance that helps us feel like we are known and that we belong. Being known through empathy extends far beyond just the simple facts about our life. Instead, being known in empathy involves a mutual indwelling into one another's life, and involves someone truly seeing us. To be known is to be pursued, to be loved, and have our shame and guilt be exposed in hope that they might be healed. As we are encountered by people who truly seek to know us, and in turn hold our brokenness, grief, and insecurities well, we find a place to belong. And this belonging is much more than just simply fitting in because we might ascribe to the same sets of ideas and values as someone. It's a belonging that divinely embraces one another in their full personhood as we become more vulnerable in sharing with one another. I would argue that as we empathetically hold one another's vulnerability in trust and in love, we might be able to experience a radical transformation in which one's personhood is embraced, and we might find a new hope in the midst of this brokenness. It's in this empathetic embrace that allows the disclosure of our messy and imperfect lives, and rather than discriminating them because they don't fit a certain status quo. This in turn creates a space to belong, a place where people can mutually indwell with one another and become whole. I believe that in these relationships, which seek to empathetically embrace us in a way that we become known, vulnerable, and belong, that we might encounter the transformational love of God. Because our God is one who is intensely relational with God's self, and he shows the empathy in its truest form through the incarnation of Christ, which allows a hope to shine into our lives. Our God is one that's intensely relational with God's self, and we know this is the term called perichoresis. This concept implies that the members of the divine Trinity mutually indwell with one another. It's a mutual indwelling that implies unity within a vast diversity within a holistic unity. There's a beautifully intimate and intensely relational connection between the members of the Trinity. And it's in this connection that we see a God that's multi-layered, vulnerable, and constantly leaning into one another, the other members, in mutual sacrifice. As image bearers of this divine, we ourselves are made to be in relationships which mutually indwell with one another through the communion of love. As we think about what it means to be human in the world, we need to hold and discover how this image of being made as relational beings at our core and actually affects us. This mutual indwelling provides a glimpse of the divine, and it's in our empathetic embrace which we might see how the Holy Spirit might be alive in each of our sacred stories. And yet, at the same time, we live in a tension that we're human. And this includes a reality of being broken and weak and struggling within our world. As we come to know one another more, there's only more shit within our lives which inevitably comes to the surface. And we need to hold that in tension. But thankfully, we also have a God who knows exactly what it's like to share in this shit. And in turn offers a solidarity to us amongst our very human lives through the incarnation of Christ. As people selflessly indwell with one another, our God is one who chooses to have empathy for us in its perfect form, and in turn offers a solidarity through the incarnation of Christ. In this solidarity, we find that Jesus moves into the realness of our world rather than one that is clean, ideal, or perfect. By Jesus taking on the human body, he entered into a world which he had to get dirty as he healed blind men through the molding of mud, and chose to enter into the position of a servant as he washed the disciples' feet after a draining day. By empathetically moving into our lives through the incarnation, Jesus shows us that the only requirement to be loved is to be human. And this Jesus' love is not one that's dependent on memorizing Bible verses, going across the world on mission trips, or even sticking to every rule in the Bible. Instead, it's a love which values the humanity in each of us, and in turn, Jesus took on empathy to mutually indwell within our imperfect and messy lives. It's a love that seeks not to only love the moments which we feel are clean enough to put on our social media, but loves all of our beautiful, divinely sacred lives. As we might affirm that we are all created as image bearers of the divine, I would argue that we also need to affirm that God's presence is found between the human encounters which seek to enter into the reality of these imperfect and messy lives. I would argue that alongside Ray Anderson in stating that as we empathetically embrace one another through the sharing of our lives, we're actually able to experience God through our actions, for our actions themselves can be theological. As people selflessly indwell with one another, we get a glimpse of a love that's shared in the divine Trinity, and as Jesus enters into the incarnation, into our human experience. This love enters deeply into times of harvest and highs, but it also grieves with us in our times of destruction and doubt. When we as image bearers enter into these relationships, which indwell deeply into one another, showing empathy for one another amidst our human experience, we get a glimpse of the love of God that shines as bright as a ray of sunshine through a barn loft window. As we live into our identity of being created in the image of the divine, and yet hold this tension of being human, we're called to share deeply in the lives of one another, to a point of deeply entering all of our burdens. We are called to indwell within each other's lives in a way which empathetically draws us to a place of solidarity with one another. And this all requires a great deal of work as we're constantly learning how we can hear people, how we can see people, how we can be vulnerable ourselves, and how to have empathy while we're all still very imperfect. And yet, I would argue that if we begin to even share deeply with one another in these ways, that we might validate the sacred stories within each of us in a way that shows the everlasting love of God, which is the love that, again, doesn't depend on us being perfect, but instead enters into the void alongside one another. In this nature of sharing, we might find that God does not condemn us based on our human failures, disappointments, or anxieties. Instead, God lifts up the weak and sets us free through unconditional love. When this unconditional love becomes reflected within our relationships, we offer a place for people to allow their true selves in person to become seen in their true identity as being made in the image of God. And we also allow them the space to become vulnerable and share truths into a place of compassion and belong in that. Empathy, which begets the sharing of reality, provides an opportunity where we might get a glimpse of hope. It's a hope that does not repress grief, tears, or pain, but rather enables us to see beyond them and live in communion with one another with the anticipation of the magnificent work that God is up to. This is a hope which we might find the start of a new trail in the depths of our densest forest, as those who embrace us walk side by side along the way in conversation, comfort, and gentle challenge. This is a hope which knows that yes, our journey is far from over, but we have compassionate companions who seek to value us in a way which we can feel free to be authentically ourselves. It's a hope that's realistic and saying, yes, we need to not be faking it, but instead of shaming us, it gently pushes us to learn. I would argue that as we continue to journey together, we might encounter a hope and a love which allows us to be seen, heard, and welcomed into the huge arms of a God who does not discriminate based on our brokenness, but instead cares for the creation in a way which shares in the share. So what might this look like in our ministries? I would guess that there's probably a different answer for everyone in this room. Some might say there needs to be new programmatic events like the one that I shared in the beginning. And some might say there needs to be student testimonies in the gatherings. And some might even just say that time together as a group might provide opportunities to see and share with one another. I personally believe that there's no perfect cookie-cutter way to arrange opportunities to share and embrace empathy. But instead, what's important is that we as ministers might begin and continue to do two things. The first is that we ourselves need to become more vulnerable with those in our proximity. This is a vulnerability that, yes, knows its boundaries, and we need to be real with that. But it's also one that shows the freedom that it's okay to be broken, and that Jesus shows love to all of us. And it's a freedom, really, to not have to be perfect. I would also argue that we need to do our best to make sure that those who are in our midst are actually seen, and their stories are actually welcomed. Within my paper, I engage with Ellison's work and how every person who walks into the door is actually seen. And the power of seeing someone as in the image of God makes it so we can't ever see them in a different way. Finally, I would argue that we need to release our impulses to simply fix the problem and instead bring our attention to the person. And this comes with a reality of, yes, we hope for the transformation and the healing of burdens, but I would also argue that this hope comes out of being loved by someone, truly at our fullest. Behind me, there's been a slideshow playing of many people who...
Absolutely.
Behind me, there's been a slideshow playing of many people who I've encountered somehow in my life. And as I reflect back on this chapter of college, I really am profoundly grateful for everyone in it. You've probably guessed it by now, but these are all people who have empathetically entered into my life in a way which has truly shown me the love and the grace of God. Within it, there's my former Res Life staff who showed me that I didn't have to be perfect in order to lead people and minister with them. And I also didn't need to be perfect in order to be loved by God. There's my bunch of my teachers and professors who, along the way, have seen me fail in academics, personal relationships, and allowing myself grace. There's my therapist who actually listens to me as I share my deepest insecurities, struggles, and anxieties. There are family members who, as I've grown older, constantly seek to know me better and in a gentle and compassionate way. And finally, there's a whole bunch of friends, which all have allowed me a place to belong, become known, and embrace me in a way which I've really been able to simply be me. And that I've encountered the love of Christ.
All right, good work, Trevor. Who was, like, there were a few slides back, there was a really good looking guy.
That's
That was,
enough.
he looked great.
It was me.
There's the guy who plays water polo at Princeton.
Yeah.
Another guy was wearing a water polo.
So my first real question